the system or the environment, but actually very few pathways for producers. One of the things that I think is very good about what Mercury Creatives is doing is that it is creating another pathway for producers and artists to enter the ecosystem. So what I do is really support people in their journey to becoming a producer. And that's my only reason I can feel I can justifiably do that is because I've been a producer for a very, very long time, as you can see. And my experience has a lot been around touring companies, which is why, again, I feel I can give you some sense of what touring is like. Those companies have varied from people like Tara Arts to a company called David Glass Ensemble, which toured a lot overseas, to a current company I run called Ballo Arthur Peter, which produces contemporary dance, tours a lot in this country, performs quite a bit at Sadler's Wells, and tours again internationally. And the first work I did, this just give you some idea of how old I am, was way back in the 80s when I first started putting touring work on the road, and I'm still doing it now. Foolishly, for some reason, whatever. However, so this is intended to give you a little bit of insight into what essentially I've learned on the road. It's not gospel. It's not the be-all and end-all touring. There are many, many other things that can be said about it. However, it is a take that comes from quite a long experience and a lot of troubleshooting and a lot of learning it good ways and a lot of learning it by making huge numbers of mistakes. So I hope it kind of percolates some of that and gives you a sense of at least one person's perspective of what touring is like, having done it for a very long time. The second thing I just wanted to talk about was just structuring what I'm going to talk about. For many years, I worked with a company and we talked about the way in which creativity can be broken down into different stages. And I found that a very useful model for talking about many different processes. So I'm talking about touring as 5 stages of creating a tour. And those 5 stages, very briefly, are preparation, as you would expect, a phase that I'm calling creative origination. You could probably call it many things, but I'm calling it that. Creative organization, stage 3. Stage 4 is manifestation, which is basically doing the show, getting it out there, touring. And stage 5, which is reflection and renewal. Each of these stages have lots of different sub-layers to them. And there's a reason why they are in this order. And the second thing that I wanted to do about today and just structuring how we interact is to say that I'm going to make a point of saying, here we are starting stage 1 and here we're ending stage 1. And if there are any questions on that stage, that will be the moment to bring them forward. I quite want to do it in that kind of way because it becomes quite difficult if you start with a question very, very early on. We get to the end of an hour and you go, was that question still relevant? Have it been answered? Where are we at with that? So I'm going to ask you to put your questions forward at the end of each one of these 5 stages that I've set out. As a very kind of brief overview of why do it this way, I don't think there's anything very, brilliant or different about saying the first stage of anything is preparation. However, I do think there is a slightly counterintuitive moment in the middle, which is why bring creative origination before you start organizing. And I think there's a really important reason for doing that. The reason is that there is a strong tendency to organize your work, your life, or everything according to your current set of resources, according to what you currently see as the constraints. And what that tends to do is it tends to actually shrink the amount of imaginative or creative time you put into any project. So I've always tended to say it is better to come up with the creative thinking first before you over-organize it. And what that really means is it really means saying that where do we feel the greatest areas of creativity lie? And in fact, the greatest areas of creativity lie when in possibility. So when things are just simply possible, we come up with far more interesting ideas than when they become certain. You have to arrive at a place of certainty, obviously, we all have to get to that place. And we go through a position of going, we start with possibility, we move into probability, it's quite likely to be that, and we arrive at certainty, we are actually doing a certain thing. However, the greatest levels of creativity sit within possibility. And that's why having this slightly counterintuitive thing of doing the creative origination before the creative organization. Manifestation doesn't need explaining, it's just do it. Reflection and renewal is something I believe is incredibly important and something we generally do too little of. What we do quite a lot of is data collection and number crunching, and there's nothing wrong with that, and it is incredibly important. However, one of the things I don't think we are particularly good at as a community, when I say that I mean as a community of artists or theatre makers, is reflecting on the work we've just done, because we have a very, very strong tendency to move rapidly on to the next project. So I want to spend a little bit of time at the end talking about reflection and renewal. So I'm just going to, you can probably see my eyes kind of dipping backwards and forwards as I'm looking at my notes on the screen. But I'm just going to bring up the gallery view for myself again and go, so far, in terms of asking questions, does that make sense? And just all I need is some nodding heads. Yay, good, nodding heads, we like. Good, so I'm going to start. Stage one of any touring is your preparatory time. In many projects that I've worked on, I've found that preparatory time is almost the longest part of any project. And when you talk about touring, although of course it is possible that a show can tour and tour and tour and tour and tour until the cows come home, some shows do, and for many shows that's marvelous and that's a sign of huge success when that happens. The preparatory time you put in is never, ever, ever wasted. And it takes quite a long time to get those things right. And most people will tell you there are kind of timescales around touring that probably start with about a sort of 9-month period, can move up to a year, 18 months, 2 or 3 years of preparatory time before something ever gets to go on the road. So preparation is incredibly important. The aspects of preparation that I would like you to perhaps think about and consider start with some contextual things, really. And the first one is a degree of, I suppose, what I would call both humility and empathy. And actually considering that as practitioners and as artists and producers, humility and empathy are two of the most important ways in which we connect with people. Humility is largely about making sure you are lowering the barriers of communication. And empathy is obviously about trying to get into other people's heads. Now, when you're touring, and if you're planning to do something touring, I would argue that empathy is probably the greatest skill you can have. So honing your empathy, and to some extent honing your intuition, are things that you can practice. And I would encourage you, not in this environment necessarily, but in all environments, to encourage you to practice as much empathy as you possibly can. Obviously, at the moment, it's quite a good time to be doing that. A little challenge for us all. But anyway, so the first thing is looking at the context around creativity. We're all creative, everybody's creative, and ideas are coming up all the time. I think, however, what that really means is that ideas are actually cheap. There are many ideas. And the real questions around ideas is not so much whether it's kind of a good idea, but more whether it has purpose, whether it has traction. The second thing, which I think is worth kind of bearing in mind, just as a general principle, is that the idea that we have of ourselves, perhaps as practitioners, and particularly as artists, as being individuals operating with fantastic ideas and delivering those fantastic ideas on our own, using our own skills, is essentially a very recent idea. It's pretty much a romantic concept. It doesn't have necessarily global traction. Not all countries believe in the idea of individual artists doing great things. And it tends towards a view, particularly in the West, whereby those things which have come to the fore are regarded automatically as good quality or high quality. And actually, that's not really the case. And so, there is so much evidence to demonstrate the things that come to the fore are in fact around how much access you have, how much power you have, and to some extent how much luck you have. And these are not necessarily related to the quality of your work or the quality of your idea. So in coming to creating a piece of touring work where you're about to say this has value to a very large number of people across a very wide geographic area, it's really important to understand that your great idea may not necessarily be as great as the ideas that are out there that other people have. And that element of humility, I think, is very important when you bring to developing a piece of touring work, because you need to start thinking about who are all the other people out there that you are going to encounter. So if we then go in this period, even before you've really even thought about touring a show, possibly even before you've even thought about making a show, you need to start filtering and sifting the ideas that are coming forward. And given any given idea is going to touch people in different ways, give people a different sense of what they think or what they feel about the world, it becomes incredibly important to start to think about what you want to achieve rather than what the idea necessarily drives you towards. And what you want to achieve may be many different things. Some people set out to change the world. Fair enough. I'm all in favour of people changing the world. I think a question you might want to ask yourself is whether theatre is the best methodology for changing the world, but nevertheless, it's a perfectly legitimate goal to have. You might wish to change a specific group of people, and that might mean, for instance, coming together with people who are underrepresented, whether those people are underrepresented in terms of audiences, that they don't get into the theatre very much, or there's not a cultural background of attending the theatre or any other kind of arts for that matter, whether there are economic barriers to those people attending. But it might also be about people actually being in the piece of work. So it might be that what you want to do is, I want to say, these people are part of the community of the world, and these people have every right to be on a stage as anyone else. And of course, those kind of ideas are the things that started companies like Grey Eye, like Tara Arts, and any number of companies that you could name that come with a specific aim in mind, and that they're seeking to change people's attitudes towards groups or communities that are already out there, but are probably underrepresented in the arts. You may wish to advance a cause. That's, again, perfectly acceptable thing to wish to do. And you may want to make money, and that's also cool. That's not necessarily a problem. However, right at the beginning of this, rather than necessarily be driven by, oh, wouldn't it be cool to do that? or wouldn't it be cool to do this? I think it's really important to think about what is it you want to achieve by spending your time, your effort, other people's time and effort, probably people's money, and what is the change that you will make by touring? So you need to think about, once you've thought about what you want to do, it then becomes absolutely critical, and this is the thing that I'm probably going to bang on about most as I talk today, is working out who the project is for. I think there is a tendency, and I think this goes back to the issue about the sort of great idea and the great artist, to think that the work is for the artists, and as for the artists, to enable the artists to express themselves. I have no objection to work of that sort. However, I doubt it really has much traction when it comes to touring. I think when it comes to touring, you need to think long and hard about who this work is for. Now, some things are really straightforward. You can talk about, somebody says, right, I'm going to make work for children and families, for instance. And that then becomes relatively easy in terms of working out, right, those are the people I want to see sitting in the seats. However, the complexities around that start to become around, so who is it who's the gatekeeper around children, for instance? And you need to start thinking about, well, my piece of work needs to be for parents as well. My piece of work needs to be for teachers as well. My piece of work needs to be for people who might be running youth groups or youth clubs. It might possibly be for social workers and others, because all of these people are either facilitators or gatekeepers for the audience that you've identified, in this instance, children and families. So there's quite a complex set of things around who a piece of work is for. And you need to kind of like make sure that you don't get too honed in on saying, oh, this piece of work is for children, and going that we only talk the language that you think children understand. You have to talk a multiplicity of languages at any one time. Those are sort of general principles. So more practically around what you need to do in your preparatory time is you need to work out whether or not you have any, and I'm again going to keep saying this, any traction. And the traction you're likely to most have is where you have good relationships. The key to any good touring is that you have good relationships with a large number of people. And if you're starting to tour, then you have to start with who you know already. And sometimes that's very localized. It might be the local theatre that you know, it might be some art centres, it might be people that you've met along the way who you happen to be knowing are running something else somewhere else in the country. And those are always the first port of call. Because any tour is really essentially about putting some pegs in the ground and then connecting the lines between those pegs. So who you already know is absolutely critical. Secondarily, do you have any leverage over those people? And this all comes back to essentially personal relationships. If you want to leverage a relationship, then that relationship has to be a healthy one, and it has to be a good one. And again, as we know, healthy relationships generally come out of mutual empathy, an understanding of the other person's point of view. And I think this is absolutely critical, particularly if your friends or the people you know or the people you want to work with perhaps are sitting in venues, and you need to be inside their heads. And to some degree, you don't necessarily need them to be inside your head, but you absolutely need to be inside their head. And you need to look at your work and what you're asking and what you want to do from their perspective. So who do you already know is really key. it doesn't actually take all that many who do you knows to get the basics of a tour in place. Probably, you know, 4 or 5 really good relationships, really supportive relationships is plenty. A lot of the work that I do with Arthur Peter is probably founded in truth around about 4 really, really solid relationships. And those relationships, I know that I can go back to those people time and time again and have a conversation with them about the next piece of work. I'll get an opinion with them, from them, and chances are I'll get a gig somewhere down the road. So building a group of absolutely deep key relationships is really important. Once those are in place, because they're healthy, there's a very good chance that those people will introduce you to other people. And that's obviously something you do need. It's become very interesting, and probably many of you are familiar with this, is that the role of the reviewer, which used to be incredibly important historically, around getting work put on in other places and touring work, has somewhat diminished as a result of the internet. That's because there are so many reviewers out there, largely self-appointed, who put things out there, that the value and the currency of reviewing has really gone down, and people don't trust it as much anymore. Of course, if you're still getting reviews in the Guardian, in the Times, on Radio 4, blah blah, of course that still cuts it. But an awful lot of reviewing, which we historically used to rely on, doesn't quite cut it as much anymore. So what really, really helps these days is promoters talking to promoters. So who you know, and the fact that somebody is going to talk positively about you to other promoters becomes, again, really critical. To make sure those relationships are deep and that they are reciprocal, you kind of need to do your research. And I would really encourage anybody to do some, it's not difficult, but sort of desk research, which is kind of thinking about what is actually going on. If I am imagining that my tour may go to this town or this city, who actually lives there? What is the makeup of that town and city? What is the diversity around that town or city? What are the other factors that are operating there? Are there lots of theatres in that town? Are there no theatres in that town? Is this a rural environment? Is this an urban environment? This kind of research is all incredibly valuable, because when you start to actually talk to venues and to promoters, you can start to talk from a position of knowledge, and you can start to talk to say, actually, the piece of work that I am thinking of doing is aimed at this particular audience, and I know that in your town there are X number of people of this audience there, or there are clusters. Or you may be able to say that your work fits within their current programming. So again, you need to look at the research around looking at the venue and saying, what is this venue currently doing? And there are 2 ways of looking at that. You can look at it from the point of view of going, do I complement what they're currently doing? So they've already started to have a sort of identity around their work. Might be a place that is predominantly, I mean, there are some buildings out there that are very evidently mostly dance, but is there any other threads that you can pick out of what they're doing? There are other venues that you say, oh, look, that's clearly far more of a new writing venue than anything else. And are there threads that you can pick out of that? So starting to think about and looking at and researching the program of work that any venue is doing clues you up to the kind of approach that you might be able to make to them. If they have any actual kind of like out there programming aims, even better. You know, if a venue says, we are a venue that is about developing and supporting work for young people, part of your job is done for you. And that may be going, well, I'm not actually going to tour this piece of work for that venue because it doesn't work there. other bit of desk research that you need to be doing is looking at who else has been there before you. So whose footsteps are you treading in? And there's no shame in that. And I think you should feel that is a positive act to say, oh, isn't it interesting? Such and such a company have been there before. And you might even be able to find out how well that company did in going there before. And what I'm planning to do and the work that I'm planning to make has similarities with that company who's been there before. So don't feel shy of treading in other people's footsteps. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And of course, once you've identified a company that has been to maybe some of the key venues that you'd really like to go to, you can actually start to track where that company has also toured to. So you can stalk them effectively. That's what you do. You go like, oh, that company's been to 19 venues. I'd really like to go to those venues. That's great, brilliant. I can introduce my work as a kind of similarity or a complementary to the work of the company you've just researched. Finally, and this is just the kind of really basic bit of info, is make sure you found out who the key contact in the venue is. You will not believe how many emails venues receive that don't go to quite the right person and then die in a ditch as a consequence. And I never get a reply from a venue when I send them an email is something, absolutely, believe me, has existed for all time. However, you can absolutely up your chances if you find out exactly who the right contact is, and that is well worth researching. Finally, on this stage, a little word on networking. Networking, bandied around, everybody talks about networking all the time. All networking, in my view, is making friends. And you should look for opportunities to make friends wherever you can, and look for environments in which friendship becomes possible. Sometimes networking is done, as you'll all be familiar with, in quite formal contexts, in showcases, in conferences, in all those kind of things. That's great. But the fundamentals of networking are about relaxed social interaction where both parties understand that there is probably some work discussion to be had at a certain point. And it is an absolute truth that an awful lot of networking, as we know, happens at the bar. And although I think this was probably a bit less alcohol dependent than it used to be, I do remember a time, quite a long time ago now, when I was arranging with others, with Theatre UK and others, a conference for all theatres in the country. And one of the executives, I think on Theatre UK, said, well, essentially all you really need to do, I don't know why we're discussing all this content, because what you really need to do is just to get everybody into a big room and have an awful lot of bottles of white wine on the table, and it'll be fine. And the fact is that there is some truth in that. And that structured networking is brilliant, but actually informal conversations where you can start to share friendships and you can start to share understandings in the full knowledge that at some point down the road, you're going to say, oh, by the way, I just wanted to tell you about this piece of work that I'm making next year or whatever it's going to be, is incredibly effective, and actually more effective in many ways than here's my business card. Thank you very much. And I'll be following that up tomorrow with a bit of a needy email saying, by the way, I'm touring a show. Could you take it, please? I gave you my card yesterday. So being at ease with yourself and being at ease with other people is incredibly important in terms of preparing the ground for touring. And that's the end of stage one, preparation. Does anybody have any questions?
There are a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll jump in here.
Go.
I'm here. Only two at the moment, but I'm sure a few will come in. Hannah Aria says, I'm applying to make a live performance art piece to perform and film next summer. Because of my situation, physically touring is difficult for me. But I would like to explore touring the film and then attending showings across the country potentially. I have no experience of touring. Do you have any advice about this scenario and where a performance will not be repeated as such?
Um, I think probably my first response to that would be for things that will not be repeated in a sort of conventional touring pattern. Um, is to look for the festival model. Festivals are very good at creating big catchments of different kinds of work, and so it allows you to fit in when possibly you're not necessarily doing that conventional touring pattern from venue to venue to venue over a 6-week period or wherever it happens to go. So probably, and I'm shrinking my answer down here with a sort of consciousness of time, but I think my first response to that will be is absolutely investigate the festivals that are out there, because they are likely to be open to both different kinds of work, but they come with a much more curatorial understanding of work than necessarily the we always program this at this time, blah blah blah, blah and so on and so forth. Hope that helps.
I'm sure it will. Paula says, how do you develop your knowledge and research if your work doesn't take place in traditional performance venues, i.e. a site that doesn't normally have theatre performances there? I'm aware that Paula is with a company called Footprints Theatre, and they do a lot of work in like performances in non-theatre spaces.
I think in that instance, I mean, it does very slightly depend on the nature of the work. Obviously, if the work is kind of like non-conventional spaces, then your essentially your tour network is going to be whoever is the stakeholder or the gatekeeper on the non-conventional spaces you want to work in. That's slightly different, obviously, from sort of site-specific or site-responsive work, which is clearly about place, and therefore, to an extent, it's a question as whether that is essentially a touring show or not anyway. But non-conventional spaces, I think what you're looking for, and your research is essentially all going to be about who has control over those spaces, which isn't really different from the concept of a theatre or a venue, because in a theatre or a venue, whoever is the chief executive of that theatre or venue essentially has control over that space. So if you come from the perspective that says, can I research who controls the space? That is your first port of call, and that is where you need to start building relationships. Quite often those kind of things will come down to it's either private or public ownership, generally speaking. And so you're either going to be looking at something that goes, there's a strong likelihood the local authorities will have a handle on it, or alternatively, a private landlord or somebody or other will have a handle on it. Really classic examples of that. There's lots of touring, for instance, that happens around National Trust properties. That goes on a great deal, quite successfully. There are tours that tour around parks very successfully, etc., etc. But the key to that is who controls the space.
Fantastic. Another question from Hannah is about promoters talking to promoters. Would you ask them straight up to recommend you to their networks and for venues that they recommend? Or do you assume that this may happen organically?
I think I think I'd be quite assertive about it personally.
Yep.
I think you might just as well ask. It's as I say, is if you're having a conversation with somebody who is either a friend or who you are, or somebody you're having a friendly conversation with, both of you know there's work somewhere in there. Both of you know there's work in the back of your minds. It's, there's nothing wrong with that. And so to say, are there any other people do you think my work might be suited for, or are there any other people you possibly could present me to, or get me in touch with, or give me an email intro to, all those kind of things. Absolutely, yes, of course, do it. I think a lot of that again comes down to the, you'll feel it. It's the quality of the relationship. If it is the kind of first time you've ever met anybody ever, and you jump straight in and say, "Hello, I'm touring a show about this. Could you book it next week, please?" They ain't going to be talking to their friends about you. It's not going to happen. But if you go, "Hi, da, 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 da," and keep it light, keep it friendly, all those kind of things, it is very much a human process, and a process about warmth. It's also about grace. It's, as I was saying, it's about humility and empathy.
Fantastic. And the last question then for the moment, which Zoe's asked is, should you follow up a preparatory email with a phone call if they haven't got back to you? And if so, how? What do you say?
I think in some senses I would go, yes, absolutely, you can do that, but don't always expect that you will necessarily get the most positive responses. You kind of have to be in the game, so you have to keep talking, and you have to keep communicating. There's no point in dropping the communication your end, because then it's dead in the water. But it is about grace, and it is about going, how can I? You don't want to put people under pressure, and because that would automatically backfire on you. Venues are busy. People who are programming venues are often have loads and loads of things on their desk at any one time. They don't necessarily have and it is entirely possible, and I'm not saying this is good practice, but it is also entirely possible they may not have even read your first email. So you do kind of need to kind of start gentle and then build up. So yes, of course, follow up with a phone call, but don't necessarily assume that the other person on the other end actually knows very much at all about what you're talking about. So start easy, start gentle.
Amazing. That is the last question for now then, so I will leave it with you to move on.
Right, so I'm going to move on to stage 2. So stage 2 is nice and short. This is creative origination, and I think this is all about it's being honest with yourself before you jump in, and I think it's hard in a way, because people who work in this world obviously are by their very natures somewhat or very, very, very driven, and I think you have to just slow up a little bit at this point and ask some really key questions of what your work is. And for me, these are quite simple. There are 3 questions. Is it compelling? So is there actually a real driving need for this piece of work to happen, to be made? And whether that need is political, whether that need is a personal need to express, I think that's absolutely legitimate. But is there a force pushing it forward, a compulsion pushing it forward? And is there a need out there? So is there some sort of space out there that what you're thinking of doing fits into? Because if you go, I'd really like to do this project that all those other people have done because they look really good fun, the danger is you just end up replicating work that's already out there, and your chances of getting significant touring gigs out of that is quite slim. There is always a slight bandwagon effect for certain things, and you need to be cautious around that. So first of all, is your project really compelling? Does it need to be made? And if you honestly answer that question and say, well, I'm not sure it needs to be made now, or I'm not sure it needs to be made because it's kind of already been done, then maybe think twice about that and think about something else. I know that sounds quite harsh. Secondary, is your project viable? Now, viability from my point of view is that can it be done well? And because I think there is a huge amount of competition out there, and there is a huge amount of opinion out there. So you really kind of need to be making things at their optimum, and you need to be making things not merely as well as you can do it, but as well as it can be made. So keeping a handle on the quality is absolutely essential. And if that means delaying or thinking again, so that you can produce something of absolute quality, you can hand on heart say, this is done as well as it possibly can be, then don't worry about doing that. If it takes longer to get the resources around a project to make the project that it really needs to be like, take that time. If it takes more people, for instance, on stage to make that project, and that therefore shifts it, take the time. It is really not helpful to anybody, and particularly not to yourself, to put out work that you feel is not as good as it could be. Finally, the one that I keep banging on about, who's the project for? Again, just thinking all the time, and this should come across in every aspect of what you do. It should come across in terms of the conversations you're having with the creative team, with the artists, the other artists involved, with your marketing team, and we'll come on to that, and with anybody who's part and parcel of your project, is they need to be aware of who your project is for. There is nothing worse than coming into a project and you get to the point when the first design drawings are brought to you and you go, those are completely inappropriate for the audience that I want to put this in front of. And it means that you've not inculcated across the team about who the project is for. And I can't stress enough that that is important, because who the project is for is almost the key interchange between you and the venue. It's the key bit of discussion that you'll be having with the venue. More important than money, more important than technical stuff. The most important thing is who's it for. And that's the end of stage 2. That was quick, wasn't it? Quick and easy. Any questions?
Not at the moment, but I reckon we wait a moment just to see if anyone has anything. You almost caught me off guard there.
Well, I'm kind of assuming I'm not going to teach any of my grandmothers here or whatever to suck eggs about how to make a show. That would seem a bit presumptuous, to say the least. No, I'm going to move on then. Cool.
Go for it.
Good. So stage 3, creative organisation. This is probably kind of the meat of all of this, inevitably. So I've broken this down into it's essentially 3 different bits. So at the point at which you've decided what you're going to do and who it's for and what you want to achieve, you then have to kind of structure the arc of the project. So you're essentially creating a storyboard. And you've got to a point where you say, right, okay, we know who we want to reach. We need to work out where they are. You work out what you actually need in order to make your project good, i.e. in order to achieve that quality that you're looking for. And where do those resources come from? You need to address that. And finally, you need to set the overall time frame of the project. And weirdly, the sort of bit on the end, which is what we're here to talk about, the length of the tour. So starting with those in order, you've decided who you want to reach. So where are they? So this is really about going back to 2 things. It's looking at kind of audience groups and establishing whether or not they are in particular places. So for instance, if back in the day, when I used to run a company called Tara Arts are the first British Asian theatre company. And obviously what we were trying to do, as well as saying, look, this is an Asian theatre company on as many stages we get it onto, we clearly want to be able to speak to South Asian audiences. So that defined our target locations where we're going to go to. And we could say, okay, fine, there's a big South Asian community here, Birmingham, there's a big South Asian community in all big urban centres, South Asian communities, but also outlier communities. So, for instance, around Gatwick Airport, there's a very significant Sikh community. Weirdly, came there because Sikh community, Punjabi community were well known as being able to build big infrastructure projects. And so lots of people came over for the building of Gatwick Airport. Consequently, the Horth Theatre, which is just down the road in Crawley, attracts a quite significant South Asian audience. And we identified that bit of history, and the Horth, for that company, for Tara, became a key venue that we went to over and over and over again, because we'd managed to work out through research that there was an audience that this particular work and this particular company would appeal to. So having thought about that, you can go down, you can drill down quite a long way into the demographics of any individual place and find out whether or not you're more likely to attract an audience in that area or less likely. And now some things, you know, are pretty across the board. In reality, if you want to attract disabled audiences, for instance, disabled people are across the country, pretty evenly spread, and in all communities. However, you then need to look at whether or not there is access within the places that you're looking for. And again, this becomes a way in which you can start to prioritize who you're approaching first when you're starting to get your tour booking going on. Second thing you need to look at is, when we're talking about where are your audience, is the venue types. So venues are of course, very, very, very different. And we've already talked a little bit about different types of venue and non-conventional venues. But essentially, what you need to know is you need to know what individual venues self-identify as. And that breaks down into, broadly speaking, commercial, subsidized, and a kind of other, which, and by other, these are venues that are not necessarily predominantly arts venues. So it might be a village hall, it might be an amphitheatre in a park, it could be many different types of places where performance can take place, but that is not the primary purpose of that particular space. So going back to theatres in cities or venues in cities, maybe not just theatres, they will break down, largely speaking, into commercial theatres, which are run on the basis of the money they make on the box office. When you're having a conversation with those venues, you will be having a very, very different kind of conversation than you'll be having with a venue that says, I am a new writing theatre for young people and we are an Arts Council National Portfolio organisation. It will be completely different kind of conversation. Similarly, it will be a different kind of conversation if you're talking to a networking organisation. Just to take an example, the House Network, which tours to smaller venues across the southeast, including rural communities, and that may often mean things like village halls, church halls, and those kind of things. There's an entirely different conversation that you're going to be having with those kind of places than you'll be having with the commercial theatres, let's say, on the other hand. So starting to understand the kind of venues that are out there and the kind of venues into which your tour will go and the kind of venues which will be both able to reach the audiences that you want to reach starts to filter the approaches that you're going to make. It's probably worth at this point, as well as talking about the commercial, subsidized, other groupings, just having a very quick word about scale. People get a bit confused about this. You may be aware that the Arts Council in particular talks about scales of theatres. By small scale, they mean anything up to 400 seats. By middle scale, they mean 400 to 800 seats. By large scale, they mean 800 seats and upwards. You will be amazed how many people I talk to who say, oh yes, we're a middle scale touring company. And I say, oh great, interesting. Where did you tour to recently? And every venue they will talk about will be small scale. So again, when you're having those conversations with venues, it is worth knowing where they see themselves. Essentially, coming back to this language of how they self-identify. Do they self-identify as middle scale? In which case, is your work likely to sit comfortably, both on their stage, but in their auditorium, with the numbers of people that they have to have in that auditorium to make their organization function? That becomes even more critical in commercial venues. Commercial venues, and there's one I know particularly well, local to where I am, that venue operates on a basis that they have to have 90% sales. 90% sales across the year to function properly. Now that's a huge, huge target to reach, and that's a large scale venue. So equally, at the other end of the scale, you might have a rural touring venue. You might have let's say, a village hall, which is servicing a very, very tiny community, and will have to have a very, very low ticket price because that community is the economics of that community don't allow for high ticket prices. And so you may find that a very, very, very small number of people coming in for a very, very low ticket price. And the way in which that is working is with subsidies flowing from somewhere else. And that may be coming from a networking organization, or it may be coming from a project, or it may be coming from some particular funding stream. So there are really huge differences in the types of venues that you might be approaching. And thinking about where your work sits and having done the research about the people, the communities around those venues and the types of venues is really critical. The other thing to think about is whether or not there are other stakeholders involved. Now, in the instance of the question somebody asked earlier about non-conventional venues, there will be stakeholders around non-conventional venues, and you need to understand what their priorities are. Now, some people's priorities are literally about animating space. I can think of a stakeholder I've worked with, and they are all over the country, which is business improvement districts. Now, business improvement districts are essentially about footfall into local businesses, but they may often become a stakeholder in arts work because they see bringing people together for some kind of entertainment or some kind of arts actually increases footfall into venues, into businesses. So working out what those particular stakeholders that sit around a project or sit around a venue is well worth thinking about. Now, there are some really obvious ones, which we'll all know. Stakeholders like local authorities, stakeholders like Arts Council, stakeholders like trusts and foundations, etc., etc. And many of those will have stated priorities, which you again need to be aware of. With Arts Council, it's relatively simple. You can go onto their website and you can look at what their priorities are. But they do from time to time shift. And those of you who've been following what's been going on with the Arts Council recently will know that they've just recently stopped Great Art for Everyone as a 10-year strategic plan and moved into Let's Create as a 10-year strategic plan. There are significant differences between those two. And indeed, Let's Create is far more orientated towards work that is both for and from the community and facilitates that than probably Great Art for Everyone was. So there are shifts and changes in stakeholders' priorities. Over the last few years, the Arts Council's priority around diversity has become increasingly important to the Arts Council around the funding that they're putting into supported venues, but also supported companies and individuals. So knowing and being aware of the fact that that particular stakeholder has a very strong commitment towards diversity should be influencing the way you're thinking about both making your piece of work, but also where you're going to take your piece of work and how far your piece of work can reach. So that's about the who bit. So then there's the what bit. Kind of invariably, and it's maybe a bit unfortunate, but in a way, I do think one has to start with a budget. Budgets don't have to be terribly complicated, and actually, in some ways, for the purposes of this, I'm not really going to talk about expenditure budgets because they are hugely variable and will depend on what you're going to do. But what I am going to talk about rather more is about the income side of budgets and where you might be sourcing income and what is the best way to perhaps source that kind of income. Nevertheless, you know, you're probably looking at something that goes, I'm going to throw a figure out there, but basically speaking, I would say your average mid-scale tour that is probably Arts Council funded, that's coming out of either a funded or a project funded company, is probably round about 100 grand to make, roughly. That's very rough. That's looking at mid-scale. Other things are parked at, you know, parameters way either side of that. But on the income side, you need to think of a number of things. The first bit of income that you could be looking for, and this is where your peg in the ground venue friends and promoters become incredibly useful, is looking at commissioning, co-producers and other investors. And in this context, their commitment to you becomes incredibly important, not only because in itself it may give you money towards making the piece of work that you want to make, but secondarily it leverages other money, because what it demonstrates is somebody's making a significant commitment to you. Clearly, if you go into, let's say, a funding bid, let's say to Arts Council, because that is the way a lot of stuff happens, if you have a commissioner on board who's committed a certain amount of money, the chances of you getting that grant absolutely increase significantly. So the commissioners, potential co-producers and other investors goes back to the built relationships. If you have good relationships, you can talk honestly and transparently about what your project needs. And you can talk about the business of making it at its optimum, talk about making it as best as well as it possibly can be made, and sort of come clean about the money. Now, further down the line when you're deal making, that may not necessarily always be the case. But at the beginning point, when you're talking to these people who you want to invest in your work, that is a moment to be as open and as transparent as possible. But you also need to be coming from the point of view of understanding what they want. So to give you an example of that, the first piece of work that I did with Arthur Peter, was with Dances. Dances had recognised that there was a large Portuguese community in Ipswich, which is where Dance East is based. And they didn't see that audience coming into their building at all. So they wanted to do something that connected with that audience. So they asked Arthur. Arthur is background is Portuguese, family is Portuguese, to come and make a piece of work. And he made a piece of work about Madeira, which is a Portuguese island, and about community. And it was a kind of prodigal son story, essentially. As part and parcel of that, we then asked local Portuguese musicians to be part of the project, and they did a lot of the kind of intro, outro music and things like that. As a consequence, the local Portuguese community ultimately came to that piece. But where that was important in terms of commissioning is that Dances commissioned that piece of work and put a considerable amount of their resources because they had a specific aim in mind, and we were able to support them in addressing that aim. So in some senses, in that particular instance, that show went on to tour all over the world. In some instances, again, the being responsive, being aware of, being engaged with, communicating with the people you want to partner up with and working with them to deliver on their aims is key to a successful tour. It's also key to getting more money. Next bit of money, funders and stakeholders. Well, Arts Council, again, sort of a bit like I discussed earlier. What does the Arts Council want? The Arts Council wants to see low risk, high quality and diversity, probably predominantly. And so when you approach them, you need to be making sure that those things are in place. And of course, one of the ways in which you can do that, and the Arts Council demands this, is that you've got confirmed partners, whether those are commissioners and also gigs, before you put that Arts Council application in there. And you're always in this position that goes, you need people to commit to you before you can necessarily get all the resources in place to make the piece of work that you've told those people you're going to deliver, which sounds like a catch-22, but actually, because everybody understands how it works, most people are quite okay with that kind of thing. What they're not okay about is where you enter into half-truths and dishonesties around who has offered you a gig, who hasn't offered you a gig, whether it's a light pencil, a heavy pencil, or a guarantee, or whatever it happens to be. Because this is not a big world, people do talk to each other and things do come back on you. And it will do you no good at all if you said X, Y, and Z venues have committed to booking you, if it then becomes apparent, not through the Arts Council checking, because to be honest, they don't very often. They do occasionally, but not very often. But through venues finding out that you have talked about them in this kind of way, and they will feel that there has been a shrinkage of trust going on there. So trust, again, becomes very important. Your next bit of money that comes into your income side of things is your earned income, deal making. Deals and being good at deals is essential. So being prepared to negotiate and having created space for yourself to negotiate is really important. It's not really all that different from haggling in a market in reality. And you will find, and I think this is often the case, and I make a point of this, is very often the first question that you may well be asked by a promoter is, well, how much? It is kind of pretty much the last question that I try to answer. And the reason I try to make it the last question is because if I answer it and the answer is kind of wrong in the sense that it's too much, it's the end of the conversation and you've got nowhere to go. Whereas if you can talk about the project and say all these things I've already been referencing, which is why it might work for your audience, why it works well in your venue, why it will inform your strategic planning, why it works with the stakeholders that you've got, you're opening up a conversation whereby the persuasive element gets you a long way down the road before you have to name the nasty figure. And naming the nasty figure, you have to do it. Of course you have to do it. But what I would always suggest is that you're giving yourself wriggle room and space to play. If your budget is so tight that it all has to be at the level that you've imagined the fee needs to be at, and somebody comes along and says, well, I can only give you a box office split, but you really want to do that gig, you've created a problem for yourself. So actually creating space in which you can move and space in which you can move on the expenditure budget as well as the income budget is really helpful. In terms of the earned income that you may or may not get, and I don't know how familiar you are with this, it comes in many ways. The easiest way, and the way you kind of should be aiming for, but you won't get it on all occasions, it's just a guarantee. And the terminology goes, it's a guarantee, which basically means I'm going to give you X amount of money, that's it, come what may. Even if one person turns up, even if 1 million people turn up, here's the amount of money you get. Straightforward, easy, nice to put in a budget, don't have to worry too much about it. Then you get splits. Splits are generally box office splits. They're almost invariably in favour of the producer. So the producer, the incoming producer, the touring producer will get the larger amount, and the venue will get the smaller amount. The split can absolutely vary from anything really to sort of 50-50 up to 90-10 percentages. So don't be surprised and be prepared to negotiate. That's all I would really say about splits. And the split is, normally speaking, on the it's a split of the box office taking that the venue gets. Slightly more complicatedly, first calls, and indeed second calls, and possibly even third calls. These are when you've agreed that a certain target has been met, and that may be a box office target, generally a box office target, and you go, at this point, we now agree to split the next bit of income that the venue receives, and that will be the first call. You might then go, it goes beyond that target, and you reach the second call, and you agree who has that bit of money, and so on and so forth. And theoretically, you can go on and on and on infinitely until you've maxed out the capacity take of the venue. But a first call is essentially a discussion around what happens when you've done sort of better than you probably thought you would do. And I think it's worth mentioning first calls when you're in discussions with people, when you're talking about box office splits, but don't necessarily expect people to jump back and say, oh yes, let's talk about first calls, because their priority is to go, well, let's just make the money I've agreed to pay you. And finally, in terms of the income, secondary sales. Secondary sales may or may not affect you, but they can come in all shapes and sizes. They can come in terms of the ordinary stuff that we'd expect, like programs and merchandise, but it might also be around workshops you might deliver, classes you might deliver, any of those other additional activities that you might be doing. And it's worth thinking about those as having separate prices, because it is a small way of making a little bit of extra income. Finally, what do you need to resource your project, and where does it come from? People. The key thing about people is again to reference back to how can this project be made at its best. So always trying to get the best people, and recognizing that best people need to be paid properly, and best people need to be contracted properly, and best people need good commissioning fees, and best people need to understand that if you're going to take their work on, you're not going to run away with it for the rest of ever. So you need to understand, for instance, licensing, particularly if you're working with writers, but actually also if you're working with designers, lighting designers, musicians, composers, any of those people. So there is a certain amount of, again, if you've not already got it, which I'm sure many of you have, but there is a certain amount of research or indeed upskilling that you might want to do around those particular areas. And as I say, I think the key things are contracts, commissioning, and licenses. So that's the kind of what do you need, the stuff to make your show. And then moving on to the last bit of this section, the time frame and length of the tour. So how do you get gigs? Getting gigs is a long process, in my view, and I think it starts. If we talk about sort of rough timescales, because these do vary from venue to venue, but more or less, if you're getting in good time, you should be at least 9 months ahead of going on the road for small scale touring. At least 9 months. I think 9 months is probably a minimum. This is not to say there are not opportunistic moments where somebody goes, oh God, could you come and do something? And that happens, and that's completely fine. But for the most part, a 9 month schedule is about right. For mid-scale, you need to be looking at a kind of year to 18 month schedule. And as I say, for other work, longer than that. So the first approach to bookers is that sort of period of time ahead of when you do the actual show, because of course getting those gigs booked is the thing that may well leverage your funding. It certainly leverages your other income because it allows you to demonstrate that that income is going to come through. And it leverages investment from other stakeholders. So getting gigs is very, very early in the process. And in order to do that, you really have to kind of be persistent. There are, as again, many of you be familiar with, there are people out there who make their living tour booking, and good on them. And it's amazing. It would drive me nuts, but great, they're great people and they do it. And mainly they do it because they have good understandings of the venues they're approaching, as we've talked about, but they have tenacity. And they will just gently and kindly and gracefully keep at it. And it's no different from any other approach that you would do. It starts ideally with a personal connection. It moves into a generic understanding of where you're coming from, and we like each other, we like the work, and then it starts to get down to the specifics. This is the show I'm making next. This is roughly when it was going to be. Are you interested? Could we have a conversation about it? You move on from that to doing the deal and the contract, which I've just talked about. What kind of money are you getting? How's it going to work? You need to agree the finance, obviously, but you also critically need to agree the support. And the support, broadly speaking, this is not everything, but broadly speaking, comes across three areas. It's technical support, it's marketing support, and it may be education and participation support. In order to get the best out of those, you do need to have it into the contract, because it's very difficult to come back later and say, oh, I thought you said there are going to be 3 technicians there, and actually there's only 2 today, if it's not referenced anywhere in a contract. So doing the deal and getting that support element written into the contract is really important. However, that said, you also need to be kind of as autonomous as possible. And to that extent, I think it's really important that you think through your own marketing way ahead of getting out there on the road, and obviously way ahead of any venue deadlines. And bringing together your own marketing team, if you can possibly afford it, or if you're going to split yourself into 3 and be director, producer, marketing person, absolutely do that. But making sure that you have really thought through the elements that go into a good marketing will make you, much more appreciated by any venues you are going to, but secondarily, may save you completely, because the number of times that, particularly if you're small scale, and particularly even more so if you're going into a studio theatre of a larger theatre, the marketing from the venue will have been minimal. You know, that is just a fact. In big venues, studio marketing is almost zilch. So being autonomous and having your own thoughts, your own assets around marketing is essential. And the things you need to think about are marketing assets, quite simple: copy, images, any other promotional material you can bring together. Working out what your targets are. So this is going back to audiences, the kind of audience numbers that you need to make your box office splits work, where they are, who they live, what actions you are going to take. Are you going to be doing outreach stuff? Are you going to send your marketing person up to the venue? Are you going to take on the social media yourself, which I strongly recommend you do. And how are you going to leverage the venue support that they have offered? Because if you don't actually get on their case and say, oh, you said you were going to do this, it cannot be guaranteed they will do it. With the best will in the world, venues try their best, but it doesn't always happen. Next bit of touring you need to come up with, having sorted out, you know, all the marketing stuff way ahead, is sort of working your way through what I would call a sort of pre-tour checklist. This essentially means, almost first and foremost, before everything, ensuring you have a robust cash flow. Touring is notorious for messing up your cash flow, because things happen that you haven't necessarily planned for. And also, there's a time lag almost invariably on your income. So income comes after gigs, almost invariably. Commissioning comes up front, and that's why it's so useful. but earned income comes later. And if you haven't got a robust cash flow, that can really mess you up. You need a really, really detailed schedule before you get out there, before you start going anywhere. And that detailed schedule needs to understand things like what the working week is, what the length of an overnight break is, how many people you're going to have moving from one place to another at different times. Do stage management go ahead of creative team? Do creative team, when do artists arrive? When do performers arrive? And getting that right down to hour by hour is absolutely essential. Making sure you have gathered and understood all the venue tech specs. You don't want to be arriving in a venue and then going, oh, it doesn't quite fit in this venue, or, oh, don't you have those particular lights that we hoped we had? You need to know exactly where your freight is going to be moving and what time it's moving. You need to have your accommodation sorted out in advance. And believe me, accommodation is one of the biggest costs around touring. What are your per diem arrangements? Are there things like programs and merchandise that you're also carrying with you? So there's a huge amount of pre-checklist stuff that needs to be done before you get on the road, and before actually probably you even go into much in the way of rehearsals. Moving on to making your project, you need to have a realistic production and rehearsal schedule. There's no value, again, in trying to make a show that you really know is going to take 3 weeks in a week. It just won't be very good. And the damage that can do to your future reputation is enormous. So creating realistic schedules about actually making it is important. Creating a fully fleshed out schedule around production week is enormously useful for touring companies. Most touring companies are not based in a venue, so that means they're having to think about, where am I actually going to tech or dress my performance? And often this is where commissioners come into play, because you can go into those venues and say, could we have a couple of extra days or a week or whatever it happens to be to do our tech, to do our dress rehearsals before we actually open our shows? It also gives you an opportunity to finalise the tech specs, which you can then double check against the tech specs of the tour venues that you're going to. Finally, how long can and should you tour? Well, it's kind of as long as you can make it quality. So as long as you can sustain the quality of the work, and that generally speaking means sustaining the income expenditure balance, you can tour as long as you want. I think there probably is a point at which all people start to go a bit bonkers doing the same thing over and over again. I certainly remember taking a company and meeting this company, and they were doing an international tour, and they were 11 weeks in when I went and visited them in Singapore, I think it was, and they had gone mad by then. Absolutely stark raving crazy. Everybody had slept with everybody. They were all just like in their own complete La La Land worlds. And I went, we've toured this show way too long. We really shouldn't have done this. And at that point, I knew I had 3 weeks more still to go. So there is a certain point beyond which you need to refresh it, and you need to make sure that you can actually tour sensibly. And that's where I'm going to end stage 3 before I'm going to whip through the on the road bit and reflection and renewal. So any questions? That was quite a long.
There was one from quite a while ago. We've only just got one at the moment, so that might help with whizzing through the last bit. Amy says, if you're talking with commercial venues about a community project, have you got any advice on navigating that as a conversation? A bit of context as well, though, Amy, you're welcome to come in and tell me I'm wrong. Amy runs a company called Take the Stage, which is a company that works with lots of small community dance groups to allow them to perform on larger scale, sort of medium to large scale stages.
I think, I mean, in some senses, my reaction to that is you'll have you'll expect this reaction, is finding out what those venues' priorities are. Commercial venues often will be looking at ways of developing their audiences, reaching new people, and they won't necessarily be looking at the first attenders as the key outcome. They will be looking at the friends and family who are associated with those attenders. So if you're giving a route into a larger community of people or a larger network of people, I think that's kind of the approach that I would go to with any commercial venue. You need to look at, for instance, looking at the demographics of the audience that are currently in a venue. I mean, a lot of commercial venues their audience will be older. That's just a fact. Partly because ticket prices are this, and therefore older people tend to be able to afford it more than younger people. So there will be quite a lot of emphasis in commercial venues in going, ooh, what do we do when our audience falls off the twig? Who's coming through to replace that audience? And these are the kind of arguments that you can utilize in talking to a venue. There may be elements in which those venues have a kind of, what would you call it? Social responsibility concept built in to what is part and parcel of their constitution or their policies or those kind of things, and you can play into those kind of ideas. But I think predominantly, once again, whilst you and I might go, it is intrinsically a good thing to have community stuff on a big stage where a big audience can come and see it. What you really have to do is get into the venue's head and go see it from their point of view, and they going like, what do they get out of it? And if you can give that to them and you say, what you will get out of this will be blah 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 blah, you will find they'd be very keen to have a conversation, I would hope.
Fantastic. Zoe says, so this might be a bit of a catch-22, but so far, most venues seem to want to see a film of the show before they book. How can you do this before you have secured funding, which usually relies on having bookings in the first place?
Well, that is a bit of a catch-22, and I think that's a little bit unreasonable, personally. I think what you can do, one of the ways that I would often structure making a show is I will go at it with several bites at it. So you can start with a bite that goes, right, first thing we're going to do is we're going to R&D a project. In that R&D, what I will be trying to get is, so as a producer, amongst many, many things, one of the things I will be trying to get is some marketing assets out of it. So I'll be trying to get a great image. I will be trying to encourage us, and by us I will go, that's the director, if there is a writer or composer involved, and the marketing person and myself, to create a really robust copy around it, so that we can really talk about what's going on in the piece. And if possible, and on occasion I have done this, I might do a snippet of film. But I don't think you can make a whole film. And I think in partly, obviously this is difficult depending on where you are in your career, but you start to build up a body of work when you can start to say, oh, well, this piece has similarities with that piece that happened 2 years ago, and here's the film of this, check it out on Vimeo, blah blah blah, or it's on our website, or what have you. I do feel, yes, that is a bit of a catch-22. I don't think you can expect to show the whole show, but what you can do is do it bite size. So when I do the R&D model, I try and get those assets out of it. Then I will probably do a preview, which basically is make the show and show it for a few occasions. And that's an opportunity to get promoters to come and look at it. And that is an opportunity to make a film of the whole thing. And then I might literally 9 months later or a year later do the tour, which is the multiple date tour. Because at that point, you've got all the other stuff in place. And actually, I found, just so you know, that if I use that model and talk to both commissioners and talk to funders, they're more than happy to back that model. They will go along with that. I know it sounds crazy because essentially you're asking them to pay 3 times for one piece of work, but it works.
Good answer. That's all the questions for now, so I'll let you crack on.
I'm going to crack on. So we're on the road, the manifestation on the road stage now. a lot of this, in a way, I think, is not complicated and shouldn't. I may not go into an all huge amount of detail around this, because we sort of mostly will know what this is like. But there are different bits to the on the road. I think the first thing is treating your opening differently from other things. You need to make openings special. Partly for the very reason we were just talking about. Sometimes your opening is the moment to impress upon the wider world that you've done something really great, because this is a chance when, first of all, you can, and if possible, I would encourage you, even if you're making quite smallish work, or even if there's pressure on you, to find some language around preview performances. So some language that goes the first time an audience comes in is not quite as high pressure as this is an all or nothing moment. So it's worth thinking about whether you can have that conversation with anybody around a preview performance, preview or many preview performances. The next things around opening that tend to happen is you will tend to have press coming in and reviewers coming in, whether they're internet reviewers, as I talked about at the beginning, or whether they're proper, I shouldn't really say that, reviewers. And you need to manage that process. And again, it's about timing. So getting the timing right. So getting press in on the very first show, whilst your venue may be very keen on that, is probably not a great idea. So you need to kind of like negotiate around when reviews happen, because it has a significant influence. Now, many venues will be encouraging you to get the press in as soon as possible, because most runs aren't for very long in any given venue. And they therefore want that material out there, those reviews out there as soon as possible. That's fine and understandable, and you need to negotiate around that. However, for the purposes of your longer tour, if the press come in on the first night and something just happens to go a bit wrong because you just haven't had time to sort it, that has an impact on the whole of the rest of your tour. It has relatively little impact on the venue you're in, because most of the people will have booked tickets, or at least in general, we hope so. The other things you have around opening, you probably have receptions. Receptions are a brilliant opportunity to be nice to everybody, to thank your company, to thank the venue, to thank your commissioners, to invite other people you would like to come along, to thank them, to thank your stakeholders, and generally make people think that you're a really lovely person to have in their building. And finally, opening, you should celebrate. You should celebrate getting to that point, because it's not easy, it's really tough. And just to have got to the point where you have a show and you've shown it to people and hopefully they've enjoyed it is something you should celebrate and feel good about. Moving on from getting over that lovely bit, there is troubleshooting at venues. Troubleshooting at venues is often about three areas. It's often about marketing, whether the marketing's been done in the way you would hope for. And I think the answer to that question goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is creating as much autonomy as you possibly can around your marketing, so that even though when the venue steps in, as many venues do, and step in really well and are really hot on their marketing and know their audiences really, really well, and don't ever discount that, it is brilliant when you have a great marketing operation and they have a great marketing operation, you do incredibly well. When the venue, for whatever reason, whether it's time or money or just not that bothered, doesn't have that brilliant marketing operation, then the fact that you've got an autonomous one is very useful, and can save you and can save your show. The second area, which always gets a little bit difficult in troubleshooting, is the tech. Tech support, this comes back to what have you written in the contract? Is it in the contract? Is there sticking to the contract? Have you got the contract available to reference? Has your production manager or your stage manager got the tech spec, particularly the technical rider of the contract available to them, so they can say, oh, sorry, we were promised this number of people or this bit of kit and it's not here, it's in the contract. Really important. And again, it's never, or almost never, malicious. it's quite often pressure, oversight, other things having knock-on effects, why tech doesn't get delivered the way you might want it to be. The final thing you might have to troubleshoot over is payment. Because of the nature of cash flow of touring, and because payment always comes invariably after performance, you do need to be on top of that business of payment, because you can easily get into a position whereby if payments are coming slightly later than you've expected, your cash flow starts to go very, very wonky. So you need to be on top of that payment thing. And if payment is critical, you sort of do need to be quite assertive about it. I hope you never have to do some of the things that I have had to do, but I have had to be in venues. And to be fair, this has never been in this country. And said 30 minutes before the show goes up, this performance will not be happening unless I see money in my bank account now. And facing off people like that. Now, I absolutely hope you never have to do that, but you have to be on top of payment, because if you're not on top of payment, everything else goes wonky. And what you don't want is performers not being paid on time at the end of the week, and then them starting to say, well, what's going on? And it unravels very fast. Thinking about when you're on the road, the different types of performances that you need to think about. So these are performances that might be to specific audiences. So if you've got a particular audience that might be coming from a particular community, for instance, you might just like to think about things like front of house and stuff like that. For instance, just going back to days at Tara, one of the things that we worked out is South Asian audiences, many of whom don't drink alcohol, not very comfortable in the bar areas of theatres. And if you can make an area which is very clearly about non-alcoholic drinks, this actually makes that audience feel much more comfortable. So thinking about those kind of things is really important. Thinking about the issues around accessibility. Are you going to offer relaxed performances, signed performances, audio described performances, subtitle or subtitle performances? All those kind of things, again, need to be thought about in advance and need to be agreed about in advance with the venue. And these may be absolutely key to going right back to the beginning, what you're trying to achieve with your piece of work. So actually, if having a relaxed performance in any given venue or across all performances is absolutely essential to the piece of work that you're making and what you want to achieve, you have to have talked about that way back at the beginning. Thinking about gala nights is always worthwhile, if you can. These are kind of like those special nights where essentially you're trying to big yourselves up, and this could be an investment for the future. It also has it can create a huge amount of warmth around your relationship with a particular promoter or a particular venue, because people feel good about those things. Sometimes money can be raised through them. It's not always essential to be raising money, but to make things feel, again, a bit celebratory, a bit special, always good. Creating moments where you're creating a showcase within your tour is very, very useful for the future. Now, this might be essentially going, on this particular night, we are going to book out a whole load of seats and we're going to comp a load of promoters that we want to come for the future. And we will bring those promoters in, they can see the show, and that's money in the bank for future tours. The next thing you think about, as well as performances, is non-performance activity. What are the kind of things you're doing around the tour? These can be real deal makers for you. And it's worth thinking about what are the additional things you can offer. What can you offer in terms of additional promotional activity? Will your performers go and sing on the radio? What can you do in terms of outreach and audience engagement? Are you prepared to go out and meet people in the community, meet community leaders, etc., etc.? What would you do in terms of educational activity? Is there stuff that you can do in schools or with school groups? Are there workshops that you might deliver? And finally, what is the feel of your company in that venue? Does your company engage with the team, engage with the staff, and actually create warm relationships? Because so often, one of the reasons people get rebooked is because venue managers and venue staff teams have reported that company was really nice. And it's kind of obvious, But actually, sometimes companies are not nice. Sometimes companies are bossy, overly assertive, and overly focused on their particular thing. If you can embrace the place you go to, the chances of being invited back massively go up. Quality control. Quality control is tough when you're on the road, and you do need to think about how you maintain that quality, because again, it is the thing by which you are judged going forward. So thinking about your line management and who is reporting to who and what your contacts and communications are like. Now, some directors will just travel with the show and be there all the time, and that's a form of quality control. Other forms of quality control is ensuring you are getting show reports. If you're not getting a formal show report, that at least you're picking up the phone and saying, how did the show go last night? Oh, how many people did we have in? Oh, what was the reaction? Did anything go wrong? What went really well? Blah, blah, blah. That kind of thing is really important. It makes, first of all, it means that you have an understanding of what is actually going on out there. But secondarily, it means the company feels they're being thought about in terms of the quality of what they're delivering. And that is both not only good for ensuring what they're actually doing, but it's actually really good for their company morale, and touching base with the company and making them feel like you do care about them. You didn't just like say, bye, off you go make me some money, thank you very much, see you later, is not a good way of producing touring work. And it's certainly the way you won't get people coming back to you. As I say, my company had been on the road for 11 weeks and gone mad. Most of them were way too exhausted to take part in the next tour that we did with that show. Moving on, in what other things you used to do on the road, data collection. Absolutely critical and becoming increasingly critical. You need, again, to make sure that your data collection and the information that you can get from your audiences and from the box office is built into your contractual agreement with any venue, because this material is what allows you to case make for the future, and it allows you to report confidently on what you've been doing to your stakeholders and others. Finally, before we get on to reflection and renewal, putting the show to bed. Importantly, celebrate. We are poor, in my view, at properly and inclusively celebrating the work that we have done together in companies. This is often manifest by the way in which a cast will often go off and eat and drink in a restaurant, and the stage management are left taking the set down. This is not a particularly healthy way of working, and it creates divisions between the kind of creative or artistic company and the production stage management part of the company, which do not lead to good quality work. And in fact, they can damage the work that you're doing because you get a split along those lines. So as much celebration that you can do communally as a group and with your partners, with your venues and with others, the better. Exhibiting solidarity across this little touring group of people, this little touring community that may be on the road together for a very long time, is terribly important and pays you back enormous amounts. Finally, making sure you have thought about all that stuff that you end up with at the end of a tour, which is stuff that you've borrowed, stuff that you've hired, stuff that you own. That it goes back to all the right places, and that you have thought about storing it, because there's nothing worse than going like, oh, actually we haven't got quite enough room for this. Oh no, we're going to have to keep the van for another week until we sort something out, and the money starts to go up. So that's the end of my manifestation stage 4. I'm going to go back to questions. I'm realizing I'm massively running out of time now, so I'm going to be quick on the next bit.
That's no problem. I've got two questions, so 3 questions, and so I'm going to leave it there. So if you haven't got one in, we'll have to check at the end. Hannah says, if you're touring to lots of small scale venues for 1 or 2 nights each, would you still do a press night or opening night reception?
I would certainly do it at the beginning of the tour, because I think it's money in the bank, really. Because whatever you get in terms of that stuff at the beginning will ripple forward throughout the rest of your tour. So I would try and get some form of reviewing going on at some point. It is also money in the bank for future shows. Because remember, reviews about any one given show become a review about your work in perpetuity. So it's worth thinking about.
Fantastic. What tips do you have, says another Hannah, for touring solo shows?
Kind of make sure you've got a friend to go with you. I think you have to have a huge amount of personal resilience to do solo shows, and I think that probably means that I've only ever produced one solo show that toured, and I think it was true that having somebody else go with them as a stage manager was really important. I think that was quite important. If that is impossible and you can't afford to do that, I think finding your network of friends across your tour network is probably essential, so that it's not hotel rooms every night, it's not B&Bs every night. I think that could be soul destroying. I've not experienced it myself. I used to do a lot of traveling to create work, where I used to go on my own. So arrive in an sort of unknown city, go to a hotel room, have to do a meeting the next day. And I found that pretty tough, if I'm really honest. So I think personal resilience, finding friends, and connecting with people, finding a friend in the venue is a really good thing to do. And quite often there will be somebody who's perfectly happy to go, yeah, I'll befriend you for a night or two and kind of make sure you aren't lonely. Venue's pretty full of quite nice people generally.
Yeah, amazing. And the last question then for this bit is, how do you go about collecting personal data, i.e. number of BAME audience, disabled audience, or ethnicity from audiences tactfully?
Well, there are two ways of doing that. Either there is a system in place in the venue you're going to, so that may be there already. So the important thing around that is to make sure you've talked about that in advance with the venue. If that is not in place already, there is absolutely no reason why you can't survey your audiences. And you can survey your audiences through a number of different ways. It can be a piece of paper on their seat, asking them to fill in. Again, be nice about it. It could be, we will have an online survey afterwards. Have to say, not massively effective, because people don't, unless they really, really loved the show or really, really, really hated it, they tend not to log into surveys after the event. So there is absolutely no reason why you can't have those pieces of paper. Or you can have, if you can persuade people to do it, you can do slightly more in-depth surveys, interviews with people. That's more about whether you've got the people on hand, the sort of staffing around who can do that. I think people are not, I think the anxiety around the kind of ethnicity issues or the sexuality questions or any of those kind of things, I think that far more sits with practitioners' anxiety than actually with audiences. I find audiences are quite happy to answer those kind of things. And if they're not, there's always an option saying, don't know or won't say. And that is fine. So my personal view is, ask the questions, ask them nicely and gracefully, and don't worry too much about what might appear to be difficult or insensitive questions, because actually surveying is dead common these days and people are used to it and comfortable with it.
Fantastic. That's all from me. So I'll leave you to it.
Cool. Last bit. We're nearly there, folks. Sorry I'm running a bit late. Reflection and renewal. As I said at the beginning, I think this is something generally we're quite bad at. And I think it is important for sustainability. And I think as touring organisations or people who are thinking about touring, sustainability is really important. And that sustainability is really built into your ability, as I was talking about a moment ago, your resilience, your ability to bounce back, and your ability to learn from what's been before. So the first bit of reflection and renewal is reflection. Reflection is dead simple. Reflection is, largely speaking, individual sense of understanding and acknowledging responsibility. So what have you done? What have you done well? What have you not done so well? What perhaps could you have done differently or better? And reflection is literally what it says, according to that advert. Reflection is the act of looking in a mirror, and you look into the mirror, and when you look into the mirror, you see yourself, and you see the context of yourself behind you. So you look forward to see back. And it's a really useful metaphor to think about. So you see yourself in context, looking forward to see what's behind you. The other bit of reflection is, if you have the relationships, you can do reflection as a group activity, as a company activity, and as a more participatory thing. I would generally go, if at all possible, and this may not be possible, I accept this is not always possible, that if you are going to do that kind of reflection, that it is facilitated by somebody who is not embedded in the process. Because good reflection brings up quite strongly felt or deeply held emotions, and you kind of need to make sure you're in a safe space to do that. Following from reflection, there is then reporting. Reporting is about the responsibility you have to your stakeholders. Now, whether those stakeholders are audiences, whether they are venues, whether they are funders, etc., the reporting comes out of the learning you've got from the experience, the information you've got from the experience, so that's the data and the data analysis, and the demonstration that in many cases what is public money, although not always, I accept, has been properly spent and valuably spent. And to some extent, your personal reflection should influence that, but also all the other information that you've collected along the way, like your budgets, your cash flows, your audience data, all of those kind of things feeds into that reporting. And good reporting is honest. Good reporting acknowledges challenges and reflects learning, and will encourage your stakeholders to back you next time around. Flimsy reporting, untransparent reporting does not create trust from stakeholders. So ultimately, again, it sort of backfires on you. Next bit is about feedback, formal and informal feedback. You should collect as much of this as possible. And I was talking earlier about data collection analysis, absolutely. But there is all sorts of feedback you can get. Obviously, there's reviews, but you should also be thinking about peers' opinions, your friends' opinions, people you trust, people you value, the promoters' opinions, and people will come forward with those things. And if you have good relationships with promoters and bookers, they will say really useful stuff, which you should always try and accept gracefully, unless it's not gracefully intended. Around things like, yes, I think it was great, but I have to say, second bit of the second half, I thought that kind of lost energy a bit. Maybe you need to tighten that up or think about that. That kind of comment is gold dust. It's really worth having. So as much of that kind of feedback that you can encourage from as big a diversity of people as possible is money, again, a terrible phrase, I shouldn't use this phrase, money in the bank for the future. It's not only the fact that you may remount your piece of work, but it also is learning for any other show that you might do or any other project you might be doing. Finally, renewal, setting new goals. Those could be all sorts of things. It might be reviving the piece of work that you're talking about, a bit like the model I was talking earlier about doing R&D followed by premiere followed by tour. Once you've done tour number 1, you need to think about, oh, can we bring this show back? Can we do tour number 3? Oh, yes, I think we could, and so on and so forth. I have a show that I've now taken out every year for the last 5-6 years, I think now, just because I can, and just because people want it, and I might as well. And it's a good show, and it keeps the company's name in people's in people's minds, and new people come every year and enjoy it. So absolutely think about whether you can make more out of a piece of work, whether it can be revived for different contexts. That might be touring further afield, touring out of the circuit you've just done, touring to places where you'd really like to go to but didn't get to first time, touring to places with low engagement in the arts, for instance, touring internationally. So this is a moment to kind of start to set those next set of goals. And I was going to do a drawing at this point, but my penmanship on a screen is so rubbish, I didn't do it. But the drawing that I was going to do, and I'm not sure you can even imagine this, is a sort of double S curve. So these are two S's linked together, where the top of the lower one hooks over the bottom of the next one. And this little model I was shown many, many years ago, and it shows about the energy of a project. And on the bottom S, the energy starts at a point where you've got a certain degree of uncertainty, but a certain degree of confidence. You then run into trouble, so it dips. You then start to solve problems, so you start to turn a corner or turn a curve. You're then really starting to motor, so you're heading up the second curve, and then you reach the peak, and then you start to trail off because the energy goes out of that project. Where you need to be starting to think through the next second project is at the very point where the energy is highest. So this is where the second S starts. So when the project is most busy, most energized, this is when you start, I'm not saying start activating, but you start thinking about, what am I going to do next? Because you go around that curve again. If you wait till you've gone over the top of the S, this is so confusing. I don't think this works at all. But anyway, if you've got to the point where you've gone over the top of the curve, the energy has gone out of the project, and it's very, very hard to start again. So I would suggest thinking about setting new goals is not something necessarily comes right at the end. It comes when the moment of energy is highest, and that is it. I'm done. Any questions?
As simple as that. There aren't any questions, but we will wait a few moments just to see if anyone does give any. But in the meantime, Matthew, that was brilliant.
Does that double S make any sense at all?
It does to me. It does to me. I'm sitting there. I'm drawing my S's as you speak.
It's that. Can you see that? It's backwards, of course, on the screen.
We don't have any questions coming in at the moment. But so, Matthew, thank you so very much. And to everyone that's managed to stay with us through to the end, I will save this recording and add it to the link that I sent earlier on in the chat. I will send that again right now as I search for it. Marvelous. So Matthew's notes are up there already. I popped those up before the session today, so if you haven't found those already, they are on that page. If you've got any questions, then just drop us an email. But apart from that, I look forward to seeing hopefully lots of you tomorrow for a very exciting finance session with the lovely Kate Sarley.
Lovely. Can I just say thank you so much. Nice to meet you all. I hope that was useful, and thank you much, Joseph, for organising and for hosting.
You're very, very welcome. Again, thank you everyone, and have a lovely evening. And you, Matt. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.